In the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, where coal mines once scarred the earth, there's a small patch of cemetery that has puzzled historians for more than a century. 7 identical headstones lined up in a perfect row. They bear the same last name, Mallon. Each marks the passing of a young man, all at the age of 21. From 1847 to 1883, each of the Mallon family's male heirs died on their 21st birthdays. The causes varied, but the coincidence was so chilling, so much so, that local authorities eventually dropped the investigation. You heard right. The Pennsylvania State Archives holds more than 300 pages of testimony, medical reports, and witness statements. All were sealed by state order in 1884, then quietly moved into a secret vault in Harrisburg. And what you're about to hear, never before told in full, is pieced together from newly discovered family letters, court records, and most notably, the personal diary of Dr. Ezra Callahan, the doctor who personally cared for 4 of the victims. He, in his final years, was obsessed with what he called the Mallon curse. But before we dive into this nearly 40-year-old tragedy, a tragedy that has haunted an entire community, Sleepy History Tales has a little message for you. If you love true mysteries, the dark corners of American history that textbooks never mention, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Oh, and where are you listening from? Leave your state or city in the comments because I'd love to know who's traveling history with me tonight. The truth behind the Mallon deaths is even more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. It is rooted in a grim reality, 19th century industrial America, with its generational family secrets and a long-standing conspiracy of silence that protects the powerful while drowning the innocent. The year's 1846. A man named Cormac Mallon arrives in Millfield, Pennsylvania, a small coal mining town in the Appalachian Valley, about 40 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Like thousands of other Irish people fleeing the Great Famine, Cormac arrives with calloused hands, a will of steel, and the hope of a brighter future in America. But Cormac is not like other immigrants with nothing. In his luggage, he carries something special, a letter of introduction from a mysterious benefactor in Ireland. It was this man who had sponsored the trip and had arranged for Cormac to take a job at Keystone Coal and Iron. Millfield was a true company town. Everything from the grocery store to the church, from the school to even the cemetery was owned by Keystone. Identical wooden houses painted the same dull gray lined the dusty streets. The original name of the place had been Green Ale, but Keystone had renamed it, a statement that industrial efficiency was more important than natural beauty. What made Millfield different was the way the company recruited its workers. Rather than accepting just anyone who came along, Keystone was selective, targeting families who had fallen on hard times, either politically or economically. They weren't just immigrants, they were chosen for the company's community stabilization program. A total system housing, work-life, in return for lifelong obedience. Cormac Mallon, then 28, older than most immigrants of his time, had the face of a man who had known his fair share of hardship. But he had something. No one expected: a keen mind for numbers and the ability to read and write fluently in both English and Gaelic. After just a month in the mine, Cormac was transferred to the accounts office. A decision that came from Josiah Bellington, Keystone's executive manager, the man known as the brain behind Millfield's meteoric rise. Josiah, thin cold in his 40s, was known for his innovative labor management techniques. But it was in his new position that Cormac began to see the dark side of the system, an elaborate web of control where every aspect of the workers' lives was in the hands of the company. It was the beginning of a chain of events that no one in the Mallon family or the town of Millfield could have imagined. There were more than just paychecks in the ledgers that Cormac Mallon scribbled down each day. They were living records, a kind of coal dust-covered collective diary, documenting every aspect of the lives of Millfield's workers, from debts owed at the company store to attendance at weekend mass, from their children's grades at the village school to murky notes on political views and social relationships. And it was in that dim room, thick with the smell of old paper and ash, that Cormac met Margaret O'Dwyer. Margaret was the daughter of Dermot O'Dwyer, one of the first Irish families recruited into the Keystone Settlement program. She worked as a seamstress for the wives of the company's supervisors. But what set Margaret apart was her education. Educated by Irish nuns, she could read Latin and English and possessed a rare sharpness of mind, especially alert to the unusual goings-on in Millfield. Their love was swift and passionate, partly because of the genuine feelings that grew naturally, but also because they both understood that to survive and advance in Millfield's harsh social order, their marriage was a surefire way to do so. They were married in the autumn of 1846 in the town's modest Catholic church. More than 200 people attended, and the ceremony was presided over by Father McKenna, a priest whose sermons always focused on 3 words: fidelity, obedience, and acceptance of the place God has appointed. Margaret, with her jet black hair and storm grey eyes, was stunningly beautiful by all standards. But what appealed most to Cormac was her sharp intellect, and above all, her shared suspicion of the luck that Keystone had bestowed upon them. Their newlywed home on Elm Street was one of the finest in Ireland. But it came with its own invisible rules entry and exit, times a list of who was allowed to visit, and topics that were not to be discussed in their own home. They gradually realized that this was not a home. It was an observation post disguised as a promise of a home. In the spring of 1847, Margaret became pregnant with their first child. Cormac, thrifty and resourceful, had saved enough money to buy a small plot of land on the edge of town, with the hope of building a real home of his own. But when he went to the company's land office to finalize the paperwork, he discovered something strange. The land purchase contract included a clause that all of his future children were bound to work for Keystone when they came of age. Margaret's pregnancy was uneventful. She suffered from severe morning sickness that lasted well into her second trimester. But what worried Cormac most were the dreams Margaret began to recount, standing in a huge cemetery where hundreds of identical tombstones, each bearing the name of a young man she had never met, seemed eerily familiar. Dr. Callahan, Millfield's only physician, a man whose medical training had been honed not just from books, but from decades of witnessing the town's strange deaths, prescribed Margaret sedatives and advised her to rest. But in his private diary, he noted that similar dreams had been reported by many pregnant women, especially the wives of men who played important roles in the Keystone system. Millfield was now like a bomb waiting to explode. The conflict was not limited to the distinction between Catholic Irish, like the Mallons, and the Protestant Germans, or English who had come before. The whole town, everyone had to live in the shadow of mine collapses, explosions, and worst of all, the absolute power of the company. Wages were paid in consumer coupons, valid only in the Keystone store, sending families spiraling into debt with no way out. But the scariest thing was the promotion mechanism designed as a trap. Those who cooperated would be rewarded. Those who were independent would be crushed. The union organizers were chased away with clubs before they could make any appeal, and some, just days after arriving, disappeared without a trace into the woods surrounding the town. In the Irish neighborhood, stories whisper every night of families who tried to leave Millfield only to be thwarted by strange legal problems or financial events that coincided with their inability to pay Keystone and were forced to stay. And it was against this murky backdrop where the American dream turned out to be a mask for a ruthless exploitation machine that the Mallon family suffered its first tragedy. A tragedy that revealed the true price of the prosperity Keystone had so sweetly promised to its hand-picked immigrants. We've only scratched the surface of the Mallon curse. When you're ready, send us the next part. We'll tell you the full story in the most engaging and memorable way possible for Sleepy History Tales viewers. The first child Margaret bore was born healthy and plump. They named him Aidan in honor of Cormac's father. But from the moment he first cried, Aidan Mallon was marked by a destiny that had been laid out before his parents had even set foot in Pennsylvania. A destiny that would not only claim Aidan's life, but would engulf all the Mallon sons for decades to come. Aidan's 21st birthday, March 15, 1868, was cold and grey. Snow still clung to the slopes surrounding Millfield, and the air smelled of cold smoke and the familiar metallic taste of an approaching storm. Cormac had planned a small party at McGrath's, one of the few places in town that accepted Irish Catholics. But there was something different about Aidan that day. As he dressed for work, he barely spoke. Margaret noticed that her son was pale as he sat at the kitchen table, not bothering to touch the hot breakfast she had prepared. "You look pale, Aidan," she said, placing a hand gently on his forehead. "Why don't you take the day off today, son?" But Aidan, as stubborn as his father, insisted that he was fine. He had just been promoted to watch supervisor in the deepest mine, a position that came with great responsibility and the scrutiny of his superiors. Taking time off on his birthday might raise questions that Aidan could not risk. The morning shift started at 6 o'clock sharp. The miners gathered in the lighthouse to receive safety equipment before entering the ground. Aidan's group was 12 mostly Irish, with a few reluctant Germans also on board. They were working in Shaft 7, nearly 400 feet underground. The coal veins there were rich and dangerous, collapse-prone flammable. According to the company's official report at 2:17 p.m., a methane explosion ripped through Shaft 7 with terrifying force. The blast echoed through town, rattling windows, sending wives running into the streets pale with panic. Mining accidents were not uncommon, but this one was different. Too precise, too neat, unlike the random accidents that often claimed lives in a chaotic, disorganized way. 3 hours later, the rescue team reached the scene. They found 11 men unconscious but alive. Their bodies had been thrown against the cliffs by the force of the explosion. Aidan Mallon, found right in the middle of the epicenter, was unharmed, unburned, unscratched, lying as if he were taking a nap. The first doctor on the scene, Dr. Callahan, wrote in his diary, Aidan did not appear to have died from the explosion, but from all vital functions simultaneously ceasing at the exact moment of the accident. When the miners regained consciousness, they all told the same story. They were chatting when Aidan suddenly fell silent. He looked at his pocket watch, then smiled. It's time. No one knew what that meant. A few seconds later, the explosion tore the shaft apart. 3 days later, a letter was found in Aidan's coat, written in his own handwriting, dated 2 weeks before the explosion. It contained detailed instructions for his own funeral, along with a list of items he wanted to give to each of his brothers. Aidan wrote the last line in his neat, sharp handwriting. First payment has been made. The debt continues to my brothers. Keystone's internal investigation concluded that Aidan caused the explosion through personal negligence. Though they could not explain how one man could have caused such destruction or why only Aidan died while the rest of the group survived. The Malins received a small settlement, and the entire report was sealed under the pretext to avoid interfering with mining operations. But Dr. Callahan, with the instincts of someone who had seen too much, kept his own notes, and a hunch that Aidan's death was just the beginning. And he was right. 5 years later, on the second son's 21st birthday, fate knocked on Malin's door again. Aidan Malin's death cast a long shadow over the family. But the pain, however sharp, gradually wore away under the weariness of working and surviving. Millfield still operated on familiar rhythms. The sound of coal picks, the sound of sirens, the cries of children in the grey houses. Cormac threw himself into his work at the company office with a new intensity, as if the columns of numbers and the inventory could shield him from the questions that recurred in his mind every night. Margaret seemed to have aged a decade in the months since her son's funeral. Her once luscious hair was streaked with silver, and her eyes, once stormy, were often lifeless and distant. But the most obvious change was her second son, Elias Malin. If Aidan had been the epitome of calm and responsibility, Elias was the wild wind, brilliantly intelligent but unruly and reckless. He had his mother's sharp mind, but lacked his brother's balance. Elias had been reprimanded more than once for talking back to his superiors or defending workers who had been treated unfairly. In the years since Aidan's death, Elias began digging into the hidden secrets. He spent hours in the town's tiny library, poring over mine safety reports, scouring newspaper articles about similar accidents. He tracked down every surviving member of his brother's crew. Most had left Millfield unwilling to return to that dark hell after what they had witnessed. What Elias discovered kept him awake. Mine records showed that Shaft 7 had been deemed unsafe with unusually high methane levels in the weeks before the accident. Even more shocking, Aidan had been asked to work a double shift on the fateful day, something that was strictly forbidden in dangerous areas. The most devastating blow was an old letter, signed by Josiah Bellington himself, ordering Aidan to perform a special check of the airbags in the basement on his 21st birthday. When Elias confronted his father with the letter, Cormac's reaction left him speechless. The once quiet and dignified man suddenly went berserk. His face red with rage, he snatched the letter and threw it into the fireplace. No explanation. Some things are better left in the grave. Son Cormac whispered, his voice low but sharp as a knife. Your brother is dead, and nothing you do can change that. Stop digging, or you'll follow in his footsteps. But Elias who was almost 21, did not back down. He secretly met with former Keystone employees who had left the company under questionable circumstances, and the stories they told him were like a roadmap to a nightmare. They told of union organizers who had died suddenly in unexpected accidents, of whistleblowers who had disappeared without a trace into the Pennsylvania woods, of select families like the Mallons who had a special connection to Keystone through blood contracts drawn up decades earlier. According to the old miners, those contracts were more than just labor contracts. They were promises with special payments that could only be met by death. And the chilling thing was the payments always came at the right time, always on important birthdays, always aimed at young men, those who might carry on the bloodline and disrupt the old order. As his 21st birthday approached, Elias became increasingly tense and erratic. He began carrying a gun, refusing to work alone, and frequently claiming he was being watched. Margaret found him standing absent-mindedly by the window one morning. Fully dressed, even though it was still dark, his eyes fixed on the misty mountains, unblinking. "They're coming, Mom," he whispered without turning, just like they did with Aiden. "But I won't let them have me." Margaret tried to dismiss her son's fears as the aftershocks of grief, but deep inside, she felt a chill creeping in. The chill came not from the mountain wind, but from the sense that history was repeating itself in a cruel way. The night before Elias's birthday, she knelt before the small altar in her room, a statue of the Virgin Mary, a rosary, and a picture of Aiden. The candle flickered in the frantic prayers of a mother with nothing else to cling to. But then, some prayers were answered not with salvation but with deeper trials. The dawn of March 15th, 1873. Elias's 21st birthday opened in a fog as thick as ever. The entire Appalachian Mountains seemed to melt away. Millfield became as isolated as a ship stranded in a sea of white mist, drifting aimlessly without a shore. And when the vision is blurred, what is coming from behind the mist? Ready to hear more? Send me the next part. The Mallon story is getting deeper, and if you're listening from a small town, in the mist or under the yellow lights, don't forget to leave the name of your town in the comments. We're telling stories together. Ask ChatGPT Elias. Donnelly had prepared carefully for his 21st birthday, but no amount of planning, no matter how meticulous, could have prepared him for what awaited him on the morning of March 22nd, 1873. A foggy and strangely uncertain morning. Unlike his brother Patrick, who died in the suffocating darkness of the mine, Elias's death occurred in broad daylight, witnessed by dozens of people, and remained as mysterious as an unsolved puzzle. That day, Elias had taken a leave of absence from the company's sawmill, claiming he was ill. But instead of resting at home, he took his father's old shotgun and a box of ammunition and quietly climbed the steeple of St. Michael's Church, which overlooked all the roads leading into the town of Millfield. In that sacred space, Elias had turned the tower into a small fortress. He pulled up a bench to block the path, his face haggard and his clothes disheveled as if he had not slept or eaten for days. It was the old priest Dermot Callahan, who had baptized all the Donnelly children who first discovered Elias during the morning mass. "Elias, my son the priest," said softly, his hands held out in front of him to show his innocence. "What brings you to the house of God with that weapon?" Elias's reply was a series of disjointed whispers, both accusation and plea for help. At first, Father Callahan thought he was simply distraught with grief. But as Elias began to mention names and dates, his skepticism gave way to a growing fear. Elias insists that Patrick's death was no accident, but a deliberate ritual murder, part of a blood pact between the Donnelly family and the Keystone Mining Company. The explosion at Shaft 7 was timed to coincide precisely with Patrick's 21st birthday, and it was just one in a series of sacrifices that had been going on for decades. "They'll come for me today," Father Elias says, his voice shaking, and then Michael, then Jonathan, and finally little Finn. Every Donnelly boy on his 21st birthday until the debt is paid, or until there's no one left to sacrifice. Despite Father Callahan's attempts to comfort him, Elias remains depressed. He says he's found documents proving the blood pact was real, but he's hidden them away, refusing to reveal their whereabouts. And today, his only plan was to shoot his killer from the bell tower before they could do anything. He believed that this would break the curse. At noon, the church bells began to ring. Elias suddenly tensed, his eyes fixed on the main street of the town. "There," Elias whispered. "Do you see that father, 3 men in black robes? They're not from Millfield. I've never seen them before." Father Callahan frowned, looking out the narrow window. On the street, the same familiar people were walking through the fading mist. None of them looked strange or suspicious. But when he turned around, he saw that Elias had raised his gun eyes, unblinking his hand on the trigger. His face was as cold as stone. And then it happened. As Elias pulled the trigger, aiming the gun at what he believed to be the approaching assassins, the gun suddenly exploded. But not just any explosion, it shattered in Elias's hand as if someone from within had broken fate. You are following Sleepy History Tales, where historical stories are not just about the past, but about mysteries that have never been solved. Was Elias's death an accident, or an intervention from an unseen force? We will continue to explore that in the next part. Pietro Bellini died in 1864, crushed by a mine cart rolling into a shaft wall while he was inspecting equipment he had declared safe just hours earlier. More recently, in 1871, Edward Donnelly, a good swimmer who had been born on the banks of the stream that ran through town, drowned in knee-deep water. Each death was thoroughly investigated, and the conclusions were unanimous accidents. But Margaret Callahan began to see strange similarities that seemed to have been overlooked or deliberately ignored. In all cases, the young men had been promised promotions, job transfers, or special assignments by the Keystone Coal and Iron Company in the weeks before their deaths. And most remarkable of all, each family had been paid a large settlement, unusual for the company's notorious stinginess. What's more, the dead leave behind notes, letters, diaries, sometimes just scribbles that suggest they knew something dark was waiting for them. Are you still following? The story is getting chilling. It's Michael Margaret's 3rd son, now 19, who provides the most chilling piece of the puzzle. Having grown up in the shadow of his dead brothers, Michael can't help but wonder. He takes matters into his own hands, rummaging through the nooks and crannies of Millfield. And in the old church basement, he finds something that has been forgotten or hidden for decades. A stack of documents. Old yellowed papers written in a mix of English and a Latin-like language used in ancient legalese. The date, the 1820s, when Keystone first set foot in the area, and worst of all, signatures. Representatives of several prominent families, including the Callahan's ancestors, who had signed on to something horrible. If you feel your heart starting to beat faster, don't worry. You're not alone. Secrets are about to be revealed. In Michael's understanding, these documents established something akin to feudalism. Immigrant families would be provided with jobs, housing, and financial support in exchange for commitments that went far beyond the usual terms of employment. And then, the most chilling of all blood tribute. In each contract, in roundabout but consistent language, there was a clause that insisted the family would sacrifice the eldest son each generation on his 21st birthday. The manner of death would be staged to look like an accident or natural death, lest anyone suspect anything. In return, the surviving members would be protected, given jobs, and kept safe so long as they lived in the town and kept quiet. Have you ever heard of a contract with hell? One cold December evening in 1873, Michael brought the papers home and spread them out on the kitchen table. The wind howled through the cracks in the wooden house. His mother Margaret read them silently. When his father Seamus Callahan saw them, he went mad. He threw the papers on the floor, tearing the pages apart in a rage, cursing in both English and Gaelic, leaving his wife and son stunned. "Burn them all," he screamed. "Burn them and never speak of them again. Do you want to lie next to your brothers? Do you want to destroy the only protection we have left?" But Margaret had seen enough. While Seamus destroyed what Michael had risked his life to find, she silently made a decision that she had not expected. If the Callahans were truly bound by a contract written in blood, then it was time to renegotiate, or die in a last-ditch effort to break the chains forged generations ago. Are you still here, dear viewers? If you feel your skin starting to crawl, hit that like button to motivate Sleepy History Tales to continue telling the rest of the nightmare called Millfield. And share this video with a friend who dares to explore the buried secrets. The journey is long, and the darker it gets, the thicker it gets. Ask ChatGPT. The winter of 1873 was so bitter that even the oldest people in the village shook their heads and sighed. Snow fell thickly, freezing the main streets of Millfield. But the coldest thing was not the weather. It was in the bricks and the old wooden doors of the Murphy house, where three people who had loved each other now lived in oppressive silence, each keeping secrets that could destroy them all. On the morning of February 14th, 1874, exactly 2 months before Michael Murphy's 21st birthday, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She had not slept for many nights, her mind racing with fear and anger. But now she knew that the only thing worse than fighting fate was to stand by and watch another child die as part of some evil pact. A pact that her family had no idea had been made a generation before. This time, Margaret won't wait for the darkness to quietly take her third child. She'll strike first and go straight for the people behind it all. In the previous deaths, the common thread is clear: each young man died alone, unwitnessed, unprotected. Margaret decides to break the cycle. Her first move is to seek out Father O'Malley, the only person she believes has a shred of sanity amid this web of intrigue. When Margaret tells him what she's told him, the old priest initially resists. He's still haunted by Thomas's grisly death in the church's bell tower. But when she shows him the copies Michael has found, copies she secretly backed up before her husband Seamus burned the originals. The priest's eyes change. Father O'Malley begins to investigate the church's old files himself, and what he finds is even more horrifying than Margaret's story. The church's construction records show that all of the money came from Keystone coal and iron. What's more, for more than half a century, the priests who served there seem to have been more than just spiritual guides. They also acted as witnesses to contracts agreements that blurred the line between blessing and sacrifice. The most obvious piece of evidence was an old ledger hidden behind a false wall in the sacristy. The faded pages listed the names of immigrant families, the dates they signed, and the creepy terms what could be called a spiritual transaction. In the entry for the Murphys, Seamus's father had written in his own hand, 7 sons in exchange for fortune and opportunity in the new land. Now, with evidence in hand, Margaret and Father O'Malley set out to bring the truth to light. They would contact other families who had lost sons, find more documents, and take the case to law enforcement agencies outside Millfield, where Keystone was not involved. However, there was one variable they could not control: Michael Murphy himself. At 19, he had the Murphys' signature stubbornness and a courage that could easily turn to recklessness. When he learned that his mother and the priest were planning to protect him, Michael refused to run away. He vowed to confront Keystone directly and force them to reveal the truth, no matter what the consequences. That fateful day took place in early March in bitter cold. Michael entered Keystone headquarters carrying a copy of his grandfather's original contract and demanded to see Josiah Bentley, the company's head, and the board members. What happened next was unforgettable for all who witnessed it. Bentley, upon seeing the documents he had thought had been destroyed, lost control. His usual calm demeanor vanished. He stammered in a strange language, a mix of English and something more ancient. His eyes kept darting around the window frame as if waiting for something terrible to appear. The others in the room, Keystone's top brass, didn't look as shocked as Bentley. They were silent, but their eyes were cold and calculating. The first to speak was Ezra Caldwell, not the doctor but his cousin, the company's legal counsel. He whispered a few words to his colleagues, then turned to Michael with one last offer, what they called a complete solution. The terms were simple. Michael would keep quiet. No release of the contract, no mention of Patrick and Thomas's deaths. In exchange, the Murphys would be released from all remaining obligations and receive a sum of money large enough to move anywhere in the United States. They had exactly 24 hours to decide. After that, the deal would be gone forever. Michael didn't need a minute to respond. He refused. Decisively, he promised to take the evidence to the Pennsylvania government, to the press, to any place where the truth would be heard. As he turned to leave the office, Caldwell said only one sentence, but it left everyone in the room speechless. There are debts that cannot be forgiven. There are contracts that cannot be cancelled. Your brothers have learned that, and you will learn that. That evening, Michael walked home through the dark streets of Millfield. The 3 figures who followed him silently, men in black coats, their faces obscured, were the same figures Thomas had seen from the church steeple a year ago. But this time, Michael was not alone. Margaret had prepared everything. With the help of Father O'Malley and Dr. Ezra Caldwell, who was a doctor, she had set up a secret network of protection. Many of the townspeople who had silently witnessed the Murphys' pain agreed to help. The lights were left on all night, the windows were left open, and eyes were still watching. And then the next morning, Millfield woke up to shocking news. Josiah Bentley, the man who ran Keystone, was found dead in his office. Cause heart attack. His body was found slumped over his desk, his face frozen in an expression of utter horror. His right hand still clutched an unfinished letter, the first line of which was trembling. The contracts must be terminated. The rest was a scribble of meaningless ink. Bentley's death seemed to unravel a thread, causing the entire veil of secrecy to unravel. Other Keystone officials, fearing they would be next, began to confess. They could no longer maintain their facades of arrogance. The confessions poured out like a flood, revealing a system of slavery that had existed for decades with the tacit approval of local and state authorities. It wasn't magic. It wasn't demons. It was greed and organized cruelty. The contracts were, in fact, documents that bound immigrant families in fear and dependence. The deaths that seemed accidental turned out to be carefully staged murders. Patrick was killed by a gas explosion triggered by a secret valve system. Thomas had his gun replaced with a special bullet that would explode when fired, and many other sons from other families were eliminated by methods that left no obvious trace. But the biggest shock came from the personal records of Dr. Caldwell, who had remained silent for years. In his private diary, he confessed that he had been forced to join the conspiracy. As the town's only doctor, he had to falsify death certificates, hide evidence of death, and always pretend to be innocent. But secretly, he kept notes of everything. Not just the methods of the murders, but the identities of the men who carried them out. A team of professional assassins, traveling between industrial towns, always striking when the sons came of age, especially when they might pose a threat to the company's power. Michael Murphy, having passed his 22nd birthday, became the first heir to the family not to die before reaching adulthood. But that survival was not a reward. It was a burden that the Murphys and the town of Millfield would bear for generations to come. After Josiah Bentley's sudden death and the shocking revelations that followed, what awaited the McKennas was not justice, but revenge. Just weeks after the truth was revealed, anonymous letters began to appear on their doorstep. The threats were scribbled in scrawl with no indication of the sender, but the message was clear: be silent or suffer the consequences. Their small home was vandalized overnight. Windows were smashed, furniture was disturbed, even their dog was poisoned. Food was no longer sold to them, no greetings were exchanged. With a cold nod, the town of Millfield became a silent accomplice. But it didn't stop there. Other families who had bravely spoken out about the mysterious deaths at the mine began to suffer terrible tragedies. One house burned down in the middle of the night. There was the mine collapse when the father was just starting his first shift. And then the witnesses disappeared. No trace. No one spoke of them again. You might be thinking this is more like a curse than a simple revenge. But you know what? In the 19th century, the line between superstition and conspiracy was very thin. Even Father Patrick O'Callaghan was not spared. In April 1874, his church burned to the ground. Local news reports attributed the fire to a faulty heating stove, but witnesses reported seeing a strange figure retreating through the darkness, carrying a smoldering torch. Father O'Callaghan survived escaping through a back door, taking with him the last few documents copies that Michael's mother, Eleanor McKenna, had secretly kept. He left Millfield in silence, settling in Philadelphia, where he lived the rest of his life in silence, never speaking publicly about the tragedy he had witnessed. The only doctor who dared to stand up to Keystone, Dr. Elias Caldwell, had a more tragic fate. Just days before he was scheduled to testify before the Pennsylvania Labor Investigation Commission, his body was found in his office. The police ruled it suicide by laudanum. A suicide note was found on his desk. I can no longer live with this guilt. But his close friends agreed Elias was a strong man, not the type to choose death. The McKenna family was like a leaf in a storm, isolated, threatened, systematically, and silently harmed. That May, Seamus McKenna, the father who had once silently endured everything to protect his son, was beaten unconscious on the side of the road. No one saw, no one knew. The police said it was probably robbers, but the people knew it was a warning. Eleanor began to suffer from unusual, long-lasting, and extremely strange fevers. The medicine from Pittsburgh did little to help. The youngest son, Brian, only 14, was being brutally bullied at school and even had rocks thrown at his house every night. Can you imagine? A small family isolated in a town that once called them neighbors. Now the most dangerous place for them. Finally, the McKennas had a choice: fight on, or leave everything behind to survive. In the summer of 1874, they quietly left Millfield. No goodbyes, no notices, just 2 suitcases and a few coins that had been carefully hidden for years. With the money they had left, they bought passage to the Oregon Territory, where it was rumored the Irish still had a chance to live freely in the newly emerging logging towns. And so, under the cover of night, they left everything behind: the humble log cabin, the old land, even the graves of their 2 sons, Patrick and Thomas. The journey west was not easy, not only because of the rigors of the 1874 transcontinental journey, but also because of the ever-present fear. Seamus kept a watchful eye on each of the other passengers on the train. Eleanor held her children close, never taking her eyes off them. They didn't know if the enemy was following them, but they didn't dare take the risk. They finally stopped at a small town called Cedar Falls, situated in the Cascade Mountains, about 60 miles east of Portland. Logging here was tough, but there were no blood contracts, no ruthless control by the coal companies. And for the first time in years, they felt something close to freedom. Michael married a local girl named Sarah Donnelly in 1876. He worked as a timber cruiser, valuing timber for the lumber companies. Quiet, cautious, never talking about the past, always watching as if evil could still emerge from anywhere. They had 3 children, 2 girls, a boy. The youngest was named Patrick, a tribute to his dead brother, and Brian, the boy who had been hunted in Millfield, was now a grown man. In Oregon, he found laughter again. He, it seemed, was the only one who had completely escaped the darkness that had haunted the McKenna family for generations. Are you awake? The McKenna story is coming to an end. But what happens next? The strange things happening in Cedar Falls, whether the curse is still there, will keep you thinking long after this video is over. Don't forget to subscribe to Sleepy History Tales if you like stories that are both creepy and profound like this. Do you think the McKenna family really escaped? Leave a comment below. The youngest McKenna, Liam, grew up peacefully in Cedar Falls. He became a teacher, then principal of the small-town high school, well-respected and beloved by the people. When Liam turned 21 in 1880, the family waited with bated breath, but nothing happened. No disaster, no shadow. The McKennas began to believe that the curse had ended, but their hope was short-lived. In 1885, Michael's son Patrick turned 16 and began having strange dreams. He was driven by some force to learn about his family history. Although Michael tried to keep his past hidden, Patrick discovered the blood contracts his grandfather had signed. The deaths of his uncles, people he had never met, became a major obsession for the teenager. Patrick threw himself into searching for documents about the Keystone Coal and Iron Conspiracy. With the help of journalists and union activists, he pieced together the whole grim picture. His family's tragedy was just one piece of a vast web of industrial exploitation that had stretched across the eastern United States for decades. The more frightening truth was that some families like the McKennas had left their old homes, but had never escaped the system. Industrial corporations had evolved, changing their methods of control, but their nature was still to use people as tools, generation after generation. Patrick's investigation had inadvertently attracted unwanted attention. In early 1887, just months before his 21st birthday, Michael began to sense familiar signs. Strangers came to ask about his family. Some of Patrick's friends had unexpected accidents. And throughout town there was a sense of being watched, just like old times in Millfield. But this time, the McKennas were ready, drawing on their past experience and the allies they had in the labor movement. They devised a plan not to run away, but to confront. They would not let Patrick be killed silently like his brothers before him, but to force their enemy to show himself in public. On March 15, 1888, 20 years after Patrick McKenna Sr. died in the No. 7 mine, his namesake nephew celebrated his 21st birthday in Cedar Falls Main Square. It was not a party, but a protest against industrial violence, with more than 50 armed workers in attendance. Newspapers from 3 other states were present, and then surely 3 men in black coats appeared in the crowd. They walked forward, wordless, their eyes cold. But this time, they did not encounter a lone young man. They faced a wall of people. Carpenters, miners, steelworkers willing to do anything to protect Patrick. The 3 assassins were captured alive. Under interrogation and pressure from the media, they revealed the identities of those behind the killing industrial barons and a decades-old network of hired killers. The investigation then expanded to 12 states, leading to a series of prosecutions and hundreds of cases of hereditary exploitation of immigrant families. The final victory came in 1889. A federal court declared all hereditary bondage contracts invalid. The McKenna family and others were officially freed from the bondage of slavery. The case became the basis for a series of later labor law reforms. Patrick McKenna Jr. lived to a ripe old age. He watched his children grow up in freedom, free from the fear of being stalked or harmed. The McKenna name, once associated with tragedy and curse, became synonymous with courage and triumph over power. In Millfield Cemetery, 7 unmarked graves remain covered with weeds. The names inscribed in stone have been eroded by time, but their stories live on And sometimes, amid the old documents, one reads the diaries of Dr. Elias Caldwell, the man who risked his life to expose the truth. Once published, those pages helped change mine safety policy, investigate workplace accidents, and save thousands of lives. Millfield, however, did not survive the storm of truth. Keystone Coal and Iron went bankrupt in 1875. When the company disappeared, the community fell apart. Today, only a few crumbling buildings remain to show that it once existed. But history does not forget. It is a lesson that even the most oppressive systems can be defeated when ordinary people dare to stand up to injustice. The McKenna story begins with a contract signed in desperation and ends with the collapse of a ruthless empire. There are no ghosts. There is no magic. There is only greed, fear, and silence. The sons of that family didn't die because of a curse. They died because they were wealthy people who saw their lives as something they could trade for profit. What do you think of this story? Has the truth been revealed? Or are there still secrets buried in the ruins of Millfield? Leave a comment below and tell us. Do you believe such conspiracies still exist today? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more forgotten American history, mysteries, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share it with your adventurous friends. See you in the next Sleepy History Tales video. Because the truth is always stranger and scarier than fiction.